It's easy to wish for a film franchise to quit while it's ahead, but what if it was never ahead in the first place? From cult horror films to slapstick comedies to a certain supernatural love triangle. These are the series that Rotten Tomatoes says critics have hated every single time. For a movie franchise that has the word fantastic in its title, the Fantastic Four movies are anything but. Things started rocky for the Marvel foursome with 1994's unreleased The Fantastic Four. Directed by Oli Sassone, this film was probably better off never seeing the light of day and earned a 27% critical approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Audiences had to wait a little over a decade for the next adaptation, but would have gladly waited longer if we knew what was to come. Though Tim Story's 2005 Fantastic Four has some legitimate great casting, with Ioan Gruffudd as Reed Richards, Chris Evans as Johnny Storm, Jessica Alba as Sue Storm, and Michael Chiklis as Ben Grimm, that's about its only asset. And honestly, the best thing to come out of that stacked cast was probably Evans' return to the role in Deadpool and Wolverine. As of 2025, its tomato meter score is another 27%.
The fastest free fall since the Depression. We can't even give your stock away.
You know I can turn this around?
Surprisingly, the 2007 sequel, Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, has held up the best, with a 37% critical score. Who knew portraying Galactus as a giant cloud floating through space could be a redeeming quality? Nearly another 10 years passed before we got the next Fantastic Four reboot no one asked for. In 2015, director Josh Trank's Fantastic Four adaptation came out, to almost instant disgust from viewers and reviewers alike. According to Polygon, this may have been due to some production hiccups. A tug-of-war between the director and studio resulted in a disjointed feature with a measly 9% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. But even going 0 for 3 won't stop Marvel from keeping with tradition.
It's been a while. Didn't expect to see you back here.
Well, I couldn't resist.
The franchise's future rests in the hands of director Matt Shakman. His The Fantastic Four First Steps comes out in summer 2025, and it seems like it can only go up from here. This horror franchise about an Irish folklore legend hasn't wowed critics with its good luck. Despite the fact that the Leprechaun franchise is up to a whopping 8 installments, very few reviewers see it as a pot of gold. While other genre-bending horror classics like Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street have earned at least some acclaim, unforgettable movies like Leprechaun in Space and Leprechaun in the Hood missed the mark in the eyes of critics. Even heavy hitters like Warwick Davis and Jennifer Aniston couldn't save the original Leprechaun from a mere 35% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The following two films barely even have a fraction of that score. Somehow, Leprechaun in Space surpassed all of its predecessors with a 44% rating. And while it may have looked like things were going up from there, neither Leprechaun in the Hood nor Leprechaun Back to the Hood received anything close to that score. It's probably for that reason that it took another 11 years for the franchise to return with 2014's Leprechaun Origins. Unfortunately, the series probably should have stayed dead, because that entry is currently sitting comfortably at a 0.
You lucky charms!
And while these movies are technically billed as horror comedies, at some point the filmmakers must have realized we're laughing at them, not with them. 2018's Leprechaun Returns received a series high of 45%, so there are signs of improvement behind the scenes. Maybe by the time the Leprechaun movies hit the double digits, we'll see one with a passing grade. You know when one of the stars of a film series is the first to criticize it, there's a problem.
I spent so much time just infuriated.
The Twilight franchise might have the most staggering ratio of critical performance to box office success ever seen in a major film series. And while it's easy to hate on, it raked in more than $3.3 billion and forever changed the genre of young adult literature, movies, and TV. And while the young folk loved it, critics did not. Whether this was caused by the series' protagonist's utter lack of emotion,
Marry me, Bella.
or classic lines like,
You nicknamed my daughter after the Loch Ness Monster?!
is up for debate. But what we do know for sure is that the series kicked off with a middling 48% approval rating, and never did much better than that. While Twihards relentlessly battled on behalf of Team Edward and Team Jacob, the film cycled through 4 directors. Its stars dealt with nearly unmatched public scrutiny, and the franchise hit a critical low of 26% with Breaking Dawn Part 1. At least the series ended on a high, if you consider a 49% on Rotten Tomatoes high, that is. It's been well over a decade since Breaking Dawn Part 2 came out, and it's safe to bet the filmmakers and producers are still drying their tears with $100 bills. If you build it, they will come, and if you put Vin Diesel in a movie, they will watch. Just look at the Fast and the Furious series. The films were originally laughed at as brainless action flicks, but after $6.6 billion at the global box office, they must have been doing something right. Unfortunately, another Diesel-centric franchise hasn't had quite the same degree of success. Though the XXX movies are still fairly popular, the high-octane action spy series hasn't left critics asking for more Xander Cage. 2002's XXX picked up a 48% critical approval rating, while the Diesel-less sequel, XXX State of the Union, plummeted to 17%. It seems that Diesel's return to the franchise redeemed the series somewhat, as XXX Return of Xander Cage scored a 46%. Still, that's a far cry from a glowing recommendation. At least it had Ice Cube delivering one of the greatest lines in cinematic history.
Rock, paper, scissors, grenade launcher.
Though its tomato meter score may say differently, the Police Academy series had plenty of fans. Filled with over-the-top slapstick comedy and Michael Winslow's unforgettable sound effects, there are 7 Police Academy films in total, and they remain fan favorites to this day. While Police Academy knew how to tickle the audience's funny bone, it also kicked critics in the shins. In fact, all 4 of the last films on the franchise share a 0% approval rating, giving even the Leprechaun franchise a run for its gold. As for its best-ranked films, Rotten Tomatoes gave the original Police Academy a 58%, coming pretty close to a fresh rating. Unfortunately, that score was almost cut in half for Police Academy 2, their first assignment, and while Police Academy 3, Back in Training, was given a slightly redeeming 36%, that's not even close to a passing grade.
That's quite correct, sir.
After 4 more flops in a row, it's no surprise there hasn't been another Police Academy film in over 30 years. Of course, it wasn't gone forever. A spin-off TV show started up in the late 90s, and in 2018, the original film star, Steve Guttenberg, did reveal that an 8th installment was in the works. So, for better or worse, it might not be gone for good, but statistically speaking, it won't exactly be good either. Vampire and werewolves weren't the only trending topic in mid-2000s and early 2010s cinema. That era also saw quite a few dance movies, and 2006's Step Up was at the forefront of the craze. Starring Channing Tatum and Jenna Dewan, the dance drama kicked off a plethora of disconnected sequels. And while fans continued to show up for each release, respectable box office hauls didn't exactly mean much to critics. Unlike a lot of other entries on this list, the critical reception for the first few Step Up movies actually went up steadily. While the first film in the series flat-footed to 21% approval on Rotten Tomatoes, Step Up 2 The Streets went up marginally to 28%. Step Up 3 then pulled a full-on Terminator 2, earning a 47% score. Since then, Step Up Revolution and Step Up All In have both sat in the low 40s, so someone involved in the production really must have found their rhythm. Even so, by the time Step Up Year of the Dance arrived in 2019, the dance craze was officially over. Critics didn't even care enough to review it. The spoof genre is a slippery slope. Series like The Naked Gun and Airplane are adored because they understand how to poke fun while still managing to tell a story that's compelling enough to engage viewers. On the other hand, the scary movie franchise has always been divisive. Some see it as a lowbrow satire of the horror genre, while others appreciate its endearing silliness. It's also a unique entity in the spoof genre, as it's a parody of a parody. The first Scary Movie is famously a take on Scream, which itself puts a tongue-in-cheek magnifying glass on the horror genre. Unsurprisingly, none of the Scary Movie films have been embraced by critics. The first entry remains the most critically lauded, with a 51% on Rotten Tomatoes. Scary Movie 2 drops down to 13%, so perhaps they should have stuck to mocking the Scream franchise. Granted, after that, 3 and 4 did manage to pull the series back into the 30s.
It had these really shocking images in it.
Brenda, it was Mardi Gras. I never drank vodka before, and I was out of beads.
But if you ask critics, they should have stopped there. Scary Movie 5 currently sits at just 4%. At that point, we bet the filmmakers wish no one reviewed it at all. The Purge asks the question, what happens when human beings are allowed to run riot for 24 hours without consequence?
What if we designate a period of time during which we can all get this hate, murder, and rage out of our system?
On paper, that sounds like a stellar premise for a thought-provoking thriller. Evidently, film studios agreed, as there are now 5 entries set in the Purge's cinematic universe, plus a TV series. Since every sequel is just a variation of the original idea, it stands to reason that the original movie starring Ethan Hawke and Lena Headey should be the strongest entry to date. Unfortunately, reason doesn't apply in the world of The Purge. 2013's The Purge earned just a 41% on Rotten Tomatoes, making it the lowest rated movie in the franchise. The first sequel, The Purge Anarchy, has the highest score at 59%. Almost fresh, its follow-up, The Purge Election Year, received a 55%. The franchise went back to basics in 2018 with the prequel, The First Purge. It performed about the same as Election Year. The fifth film in the series, The Forever Purge, fast-forwarded again to the original continuity, but barely fared better than the original. And while those scores are all relatively consistent, at least as far as franchises on this list go, we're not too optimistic for The Purge's future. If the live-action Alvin and the Chipmunks movies prove anything, it's that some things are best left on the drawing board. Leading up to their debut on the big screen, the singing trio of cartoon rodents had enjoyed enormous popularity, released Grammy-winning albums, and starred in a long-running animated show. So when technology got decent enough to combine computer animation and live-action, it was inevitable that they would be brought to life for a feature film. But when 2007's Alvin and the Chipmunks came out, critics weren't singing their praises. The misadventures of songwriter David Seville and his adopted chipmunks Alvin, Simon, and Theodore got just a 28% on Rotten Tomatoes.
So, is that a no?
Despite the poor critical reception, the film was somehow successful enough to spawn not one, not two, but 3 follow-ups. Unfortunately, only 2009's The Squeakquel even broke 20% on Rotten Tomatoes, and 2011's Chipwrecked bottomed out at just 10%. It's been just about a decade since 2015's The Road Chip came out, and its 16% tomato meter score seemed to be the final nail in their tiny coffin. But darn it, if we don't still think of those piercing little harmonies every time we hear the phrase hula hoop. Usually, when a horror franchise spawns a lot of sequels, the first one has to be at least decent by critical standards. And if the franchise has a truly iconic start, it's understandable if the sequels fall a little flat by comparison. After all, even legendary series like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street don't exactly bat 1,000. Then there's the Amityville Horror, which started off bad and only got worse. Based on the true story of the Lutz family, the 1979 film depicted a family that experiences paranormal events after moving into the house where a man slaughtered his entire family. And despite tepid reviews, averaging to just 31% on Rotten Tomatoes, the first film was a huge success with audiences and has since earned a serious cult following. The same can't be said for any of the follow-ups. Amityville 2, The Possession, quickly popped up in 1982 and did moderately worse than its predecessor. Amityville The Demon followed from there, and we're still not sure of the fact that it was in 3D as the reason it scored just 18%, or what saved it from doing even worse. The franchise kept chugging along with some straight-to-video sequels, a few of which actually did better with critics than the original. But even then, none of them got higher than 45%. A 2005 reboot starring Ryan Reynolds also tanked, as did the legacy sequel Amityville: The Awakening. It seems the moral of the story is don't buy a murder house, and don't make a movie about the murder house, even if the story is essentially public domain. Who comprised your favorite on-again, off-again Hollywood couple? Surely some of you thought of Ben Affleck and J-Lo, but ours has to be Burt Reynolds and film critics. While Reynolds was one of the most popular actors ever in his heyday, not all of his movies were hits. Nowhere was this more true than in the Cannonball Run and its sequel, Cannonball Run 2. They have a 29% and 12% Rotten scores, respectively. Directed by former stuntman Hal Needham, the films were meant to capitalize on the success of Reynolds and Needham's Smokey and the Bandit, which was second only to Star Wars at the 1977 box office. This time, Reynolds and an all-star cast race across the country, and while that might sound like a reasonably fun premise, film critic Roger Ebert sure didn't think so. In fact, he was so disappointed, he wouldn't even give it the backhanded compliment of calling it a good lousy movie. And despite its rancid reception, the Cannonball Run did race close to the top of the 1981 box office chart, so naturally it got a sequel. And if Ebert hated the first film, he loathed the second. He wrote, "Cannonball Run 2 is one of the laziest insults to the intelligence of moviegoers that I can remember. Sheer arrogance made this picture, but the greatest dire was saved for the unofficial third entry, Speed Zone. This time around, John Candy and a whole new crew subbed in for Reynolds and company." That film bottomed out with a 0% Rotten Tomatoes score, and ultimately killed the franchise. All things considered, it's reassuring that at least one series on this list only needed 2 failed follow-ups before someone decided to pull the plug. Considering how popular E.L. James' 50 Shades book trilogy was with readers, the movies almost didn't have to be good in order to be successful. Unfortunately, that seems to have been the philosophy filmmakers had during production as well. Directed by Sam Taylor Johnson, 50 Shades of Grey centers on the sadomasochistic love affair between college student Anna Steele and young billionaire Christian Grey. The film debuted on Valentine's Day weekend in 2015 to a 25% Rotten Tomatoes rating.
I had a rough start in life. That's all you need to know.
But as it was with Twilight, which served as a source material for the fanfic that ultimately became the 50 Shades trilogy, that didn't stop audiences from showing up in droves. In fact, 50 Shades of Grey became the 7th highest-grossing film directed by a woman of all time. It even got an Oscar nomination for the hit song Earned It by The Weeknd. Taylor Johnson didn't return for either of the back-to-back sequels, 2017's 50 Shades Darker and 2018's 50 Shades Freed. Those were both helmed by James Foley, director of the Oscar-nominated Glengarry Glen Ross. Unsurprisingly, his two 50 Shades movies didn't even touch Glengarry's critical reception. Both 50 Shades Darker and 50 Shades Freed received just 11% scores on Rotten Tomatoes, so would recommend a safe word if anyone sits you down to watch one. The Jeepers Creepers trilogy got off to a rocky start due to writer-director Victor Salva's criminal history. In 1988, Salva was convicted of molesting the 12-year-old star of his feature debut, Clown House, and spent 15 months in prison. But in just a few years, he was making movies again, and successful ones at that. Executive produced by Salva's mentor, Francis Ford Coppola, 2001's Jeepers Creepers was a return to Salva's horror roots, and it set a box office record for Labor Day weekend releases. The film follows a pair of siblings who encounter a deadly creature when returning home from spring break. And despite doing well in the box office, it got only middling critical reception and earned a 46% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. As the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, chunks of this supernatural horror thriller are crackling good and placed right where they need to be, at the beginning and end. Others are haphazardly stitched together, like scattered body parts. Despite that telling comparison to Disembodied Limbs, a sequel arrived in 2003. Sadly, even Twin Peaks star Ray Wise's presence couldn't save it from a stark decline in the eyes of critics. And though it only scored a 25% on Rotten Tomatoes, Jeepers Creepers 2 was successful enough to warrant a third installment in 2017. That one did even worse. So what was the natural solution? A reboot!
I'm thinking past the point of my own selfish little existence now.
Jeepers Creepers Reborn came out in 2022 and received a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. And while Salva didn't direct it, such abysmal reviews make a fitting addition to his tarnished legacy. Younger viewers may find it hard to believe there was a time when a franchise centered on the inner thoughts of an infant could be as popular as the MCU, but that was the case in the late 80s and early 90s. Released in 1989, Look Who's Talking follows Molly Jensen, who becomes a single mom after having an affair with a married man. Then she starts seeing a friendly cab driver who might be father material. That sounds like a pretty average rom-com, right? Well, the twist is that Molly's baby, Mikey, weighs in on her mom's new relationship with the voice of Bruce Willis. The concept worked for audiences, and Look Who's Talking became one of the highest-grossing films of the year.
How you doing, pal? How do you like New York so far? Hey, it's my kind of town.
Although some people like it, the overall reviews for Look Who's Talking were decidedly mixed. And if its 56% Rotten Tomatoes rating seems bad to you, then the reception to 1990's Look Who's Talking 2 is borderline stomach-churning. But even that sequel's 13% score is nothing compared to how much people hate the third installment, Look Who's Talking Now. This entry, featuring commentary from the family's dogs, is yet another movie with a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes.
I've seen enough. Bring the car around.
Triple X wasn't the only Vin Diesel franchise that had to fight for critics' respect, kicking off with 2000's Pitch Black. Most reviewers called the Riddick films middling at best. Pitch Black stars Diesel as Riddick, a convict who has to wear goggles to protect his extremely sensitive eyes from light but sees perfectly in the dark. That comes in handy when he and a group of space travelers crash land on a planet completely covered in darkness and populated by toothy monsters that like to feed on people. Though not a complete critical disaster, the film did fail to pass over to the right side on Rotten Tomatoes, capping out at a 59% rating. One of the better reviews Pitch Black received came from The Guardian's Peter Bradshaw, who wrote, "David Tui's film undoubtedly has something interesting about it, and that something can be summarized in 2 words: Vin Diesel." Diesel and company took that praise to heart with the second film, The Chronicles of Riddick, which sends a goggle-wearing bandit on the run as he fights a world-conquering alien army. Unfortunately, this sequel was received poorly both critically and financially. It reaped a 28% Rotten Tomatoes score, and failed to recoup its budget at the domestic box office. If it weren't for the international market, it would have been an all-out flop. Diesel tried to revive the franchise in 2013 with Riddick, which fared similarly to the original. It scored a 58% tomato meter rating, allowing the franchise as a whole to rest on a high note. Before they cornered the market on offbeat biopics like Ed Wood, The People vs. Larry Flint, and Man on the Moon, Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski were the writers of Problem Child. Looking back, it's no wonder it took them a few more tries to gain some footing in the industry. In an interview with Paul Rowlands, they even admitted they weren't happy with how the film turned out. Directed by longtime Adam Sandler collaborator Dennis Dugan, Problem Child stars John Ritter as Ben Healy, a sweet-natured man who decides to adopt a son so that his wealthy father can rest assured that the family business will have an heir. But the kid turns out to be such a pain that Ben wonders if dying broke and alone might just be a better option. Not a single critic was left rolling in the aisles during Problem Child, and it wound up with a cool 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. Variety might have said it best in its review, writing, "Universal took a step in the right direction by whittling Problem Child down to just 81 minutes, but didn't go far enough. The studio should have excised another 75 minutes and released this unbelievable mess as a short. For reasons beyond our comprehension, it was still a massive success." Its sequel, Problem Child 2, followed with a slightly improved 7% rating, yet audiences weren't as smitten with the second entry, and Problem Child 3, Junior in Love, went straight to television. Audiences almost always show up for fast cars and butt-kicking, so it's little wonder that the Transporter became a huge success. The brainchild of screenwriter Luc Besson, fight choreographer Corey Ewan, and director Louis Leterrier, the 2002 film stars Jason Statham as Frank Martin, a British mercenary who transports goods for cash and doesn't ask questions. But when he learns he's transporting a kidnapped girl, that philosophy gets tested. While it did turn Statham into a bankable leading man, the movie didn't exactly rev up critics. It ultimately earned a 54% Rotten Tomatoes score, but many still found it perfectly enjoyable. As Jamie Russell wrote for the BBC, with a series of unconvincing stuntmen, overblown action, and a pumped-up soundtrack that seems designed to kill off whatever critical grey matter you didn't leave at the door, this is junk food cinema at its greasiest. A pair of sequels quickly followed, and Statham returned for both 2005's Transporter 2 and 2008's Transporter 3. Both films follow essentially the same formula as the first, with Frank Martin whooping bad guys and driving fast. This may have been the right call by producers, as both sequels were more or less received the same way critically. And while the immediate follow-up scored 52% and 40% ratings respectively, the 2015 reboot was a different story. The Transporter refueled saw Ed Skrein step in for Statham, and it was ultimately a 16% rated car wreck that barely had enough fuel to leave the garage. Few franchises have proven their ability to withstand critical panning the way Underworld has. Much like Twilight, the films center on a centuries-old war between vampires and werewolves. The difference is werewolves are called lycans, and there's more action and less romance. The 2003 original centers on Kate Beckinsale's Celine, an orphaned vampire battling against a fierce lycan leader named Lucien. Slate summed up many reviews well by writing, "Underworld leaves little behind, save the lingering tacky taste of eye candy, and penny eye candy at that."
Pity, because I lived for it.
It ultimately pulled a 31% on Rotten Tomatoes, and its box office performance was strong enough to warrant quite a few sequels. Beckinsale and director Len Wiseman returned for 2006's Underworld Evolution, which saw Celine forge a temporary truce with a werewolf to take on a common enemy. That film was even more poorly received than the first, and received a 17% score. Still, neither that nor Beckinsale and Wiseman's absence stopped the third installment, 2009's Underworld Rise of the Lycans, from hitting theaters. While it was a slight improvement on Evolution in critics' eyes, it didn't do any better than the original. Even when Beckinsale returned for the fourth installment, 2012's Underworld Awakening, her performance still only got the movie a 25%. Finally, 2016's Underworld Blood Wars came along.
There's really no need, thank you.
This time, audiences and critics seemed to agree that it was lacking even by Underworld standards, and it ultimately got a 21% score.